So next I'm going to go into the Revelation chapter 12 sign and the sign of the Magi in quite a lot of detail. But first what I want to do is just discuss some Babylonian and Chaldean astronomy history and the tablets of MUL.APIN. And this is because a lot of people have said that they see that the sign is in the middle of the day and the sun is obviously obscuring the stars, and that's perfectly true. But if we have a look at the history of Chaldean and Babylonian astronomy, and we look at the tablets which they've left to us, this is the MUL.APIN, we can see how they used to read the constellations and the stars. So they would take record of the stars in the morning, and they would take record of the stars in the evening. So the MUL.APIN lists all the major stars and constellations and organizes them into three broad divisions according to celestial latitude, allocating each star to three paths. So one would be north, one would be equatorial, and one would be south of the equator. The northern part of MUL contained 33 stars or constellations, so they obviously didn't have telescopes, so they don't have as many as the modern day constellations which they've now recorded. The equatorial path of Anu containing 23 stars or constellations, and the southern part of Ea containing 15 stars or constellations. The tablets list the stars and constellations that rise and that set at the same time. So sometimes they would have for instance, a cloud would be obscuring the eastern horizon, so they would know which stars were setting at that same time in the morning. So they would make sure that they had record of the stars that were rising and setting in the morning and the stars that were rising and setting in the evening. They list the number of days between rising of various stars and constellations, and the visibility of fixed stars in the east and the west. And they list the stars and constellations that rise and culminate at the same time. So if they saw a constellation rising with, for instance, Saturn or Jupiter in it, they would list that star rose with that constellation. So the MUL.APIN, an example reading of the MUL.APIN, a seasonal reading, would be on the 1st of Nisanu, the hired man, or Aries is what they're called, hired man, becomes visible. On the 20th of Nisanu, the crook or Riga becomes visible. On the 1st of Ajaru, the stars, or the Pleiades, becomes visible. On the 20th of Ajaru, the bull, or Taurus, becomes visible. And morning and evening readings, this pertains to the Revelation chapter 12 sign. The stars rise and the scorpion sets. The scorpion rises and the stars set. The bull rises and Su'upa, or the constellation of Bootes, sets. And the true shepherd rises and Pabilsag, or Sagittarius, sets. So what I wanted to do is just give you an example of how they used to read the constellations and the stars back then. It is perfectly valid that the Revelation chapter 12 sign is seen in the morning with Leo and in the evening with Virgo. So first I'm going to go through the sign of the Magi. 3 years before the sign happened, the Magi were given a heads up. And interestingly, as far as the Jewish scribe Abarbanel, the Rabbi Abraham ben Hia, and Solomon ben Gabriel decreed that a conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn preceded Moses by 3 years and should precede the Messiah. This conjunction is said to have happened before the birth of Moses in Pisces. 3 years before Jesus Christ was born, in the constellation of Pisces, Saturn and Jupiter conjuncted 3 different times. This was also known as the Great Magic Conjunction, and such a phenomenal event that people assumed that this was the Star of Bethlehem when doing research backwards. But obviously now we have better tools available to us and we can know for sure what the sign of the Magi actually was. So Jupiter and Saturn conjunct in 7 BC 3 times. The first conjunction was on May the 30th, which was on the 1st of ER, that was the new moon. The second conjunction was on September 25th, and that was the autumnal equinox. And the third conjunction, and the most important, was December the 23rd, which was the winter solstice. And I want you to keep that in mind for later when we look at the Revelation chapter 12 sign, because we see 3 years after the Revelation chapter 12 sign, there's a major conjunction between Saturn and Jupiter on the winter solstice in the constellation of Capricorn, which is the sacrificial sign. And from the final conjunction to the birth of Christ is 3 years, 8 months, and 23 days. So here we are in 7 BC, it's March 26, and we're in the constellation of Pisces. I'm going to play it forward and we can see the conjunctions, and then I'm going to tell you the dates while it's playing so that you can see exactly when the conjunctions happened. So the first conjunction was on May the 30th on the 1st of ER. The second conjunction, they're both going to retrograde motion, was on September the 25th, and this was the autumnal equinox. Then they go forward from retrograde motion, and the third conjunction is on December the 23rd, which is the winter solstice. So the Magi were the descendants of the men which Daniel saved from Nebuchadnezzar's execution because they couldn't translate his dream. Herod had this dream, and I'm sure you know the story. They couldn't translate it because he didn't want to tell them what the dream was, and he expected them to know what his dream was if they had these skills. And of course Daniel went away and conversed with God, got the dream and the meaning of the dream, told Nebuchadnezzar, and then asked Nebuchadnezzar not to execute the wise men. So the wise men would have known Daniel's 70 weeks prophecy, which is in Daniel chapter 9, that details 70 weeks of years. And the 69 periods of 7 years were a total of 483 years. They were to expect the Messiah. That would come after 444 to 445 BC, a decree to rebuild Jerusalem city walls that was given by Artaxerxes. So we can safely assume that the Magi knew, roughly speaking, when the Messiah was going to come, and they would have been more familiar with the dates and the prophecy itself because Daniel taught it to them himself. But also they would have known based on the signs of the times, because of Herod's absolute wickedness and the persecution of Rome. And I'm just going to detail a few things that Herod did. And obviously they looked around and realized that Israel and the Jewish people were under massive persecution of Rome, and that this time was coming. So just like us, we see all the things that are happening based on prophecy and the signs and all these reasons why we should be looking out for Messiah. They would have done the same thing back then. So Herod, he murdered the last of the Maccabeus dynasty. He executed 45 of the noblest and richest Jews who were the principal adherents in Jerusalem of his rival Antagonius, who revolted when Herod went away on a trip. Antagonius revolted, and Herod recaptured Jerusalem with the help of Rome, and then executed and slaughtered all of the adherents to Antagonius. He asked his uncle Joseph to murder Miriam, his beloved wife, should he not return from a trip to Rome. He had this incredible jealousy over this woman who he was fantastically, supposedly in love with, but obviously a very strange and rabid obsession that he had with her. When he returned from Rome, he found out that Joseph had told Miriam that Herod asked him to murder her, and there was then suspicion of improper behavior between Joseph and Miriam, and he murdered Joseph, his uncle. And then on a separate occasion to Rome, he entrusted one Seamus to the charge of Miriam, and with the same fatal directions as formerly to Joseph, he asked this man to murder Miriam if he didn't return. And again Miriam learned the secret, and again the same suspicions were raised between Miriam and Seamus. And Seamus was slain without a hearing, and the beautiful Miriam executed after a mock trial. And then after he executed his so-called beloved wife, he went even more insane. Then he became suspicious of a plot by Miriam's mother, Alexandra, and had her executed as well. Alexander and Aristobulus, his sons, were imprisoned, and an accusation of high treason laid against them before the emperor. These are his own sons. Augustus gave Herod full powers, but advised a mixed tribunal of Jews and Romans to try the case. The two princes were, of course, condemned to death, and when some old soldiers ventured to intercede for them, so they wanted to help his sons, 300 of the supposed adherents of the cause were cut down, and his two sons, the princes, were strangled in prison. In Herod's youth, he had browbeaten the venerable Sanhedrin, so he had a long history of wicked behavior against the Jews, and he had threatened the city with slaughter and destruction. Again and again he murdered her venerable sages. He had shed like water the blood of her Hasmonean princes, and of everyone who dared to be free. He had stifled every national aspirations in the groans of torture, and quenched it to the gore of his victims. Not once nor twice, but 6 times did he change the high priesthood. So he was interfering with the high priesthood and the things that were going on in the temples as well. So the Magi should have known around about the time that the Messiah was about to arrive, based on Daniel's 70 weeks prophecy, but also based on what was going on in Jerusalem. Paul says in Romans 11:25, "For I would not, brethren, that ye should be ignorant of this mystery, lest ye shall be wise in your own conceits." He warns us not to be ignorant of Israel, that blindness in part has happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles be come in. So Paul is telling us, do not be ignorant of this, or you're going to be wise in your own conceits, that blindness in part, Israel has partial blindness. Satan has done everything he can for the last 2,000 years to tear away the Jewishness of the Christian religion. And one of the things that we need to understand is that Rosh Hashanah and the Feast of Trumpets and the Feast of First Fruits and Pentecost and all these feasts are the feast of the Lord. They're not the feast of the Jews, they're the feast of the Lord. And they would have known that Rosh Hashanah was the day that the king was going to be born. They would have known that the Rosh Hashanah, just like we do now, that the birth of the church is going to happen on Rosh Hashanah. We know that the birth of the Messiah was going to happen on Rosh Hashanah. They would have known that too. So in the year 3 BC, if you have a look in the year 3 BC, Rosh Hashanah was on the Feast of Trumpets, September the 15th. There are a few tools online which give slightly different dates. I would recommend not using those because they don't align with the stars. So if you look at the date, this aligns up perfectly with the stars. So here we are on September the 15th in the year 3 BC, which is Rosh Hashanah. And you couldn't ask for a better sign than this, except for the Revelation chapter 12 sign. So I'm going to go through the celestial map as we see it, and that's from the space perspective, and then I'm going to go through the terrestrial, and I'm going to do that for the Magi sign and for the Revelation chapter 12 sign. So here we see Jupiter, Tzedek, the righteousness, the king star Regulus, and the king planet directly over the king star Regulus. We see Venus, which is splendor or Noga, over the star Zania, which means corner, and he was the cornerstone which the builder rejected. The location of Mercury on this sign meant that in the rare occasion that we can see Mercury and Venus as the morning star, we can see it situated here because Mercury is very close to the sun, so we can't often see it in the morning, but on this day we could see it. And in Job 38 it says, "When the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy." So we see the two morning stars visible on the day that Jesus Christ was born. And then obviously the sun was by the womb of Virgo. But that wasn't the only thing that was going on in the heavens. Just to confirm, you see Mars dead in the center of the sacrificial sign of Capricorn. So the sign of Capricorn is obviously a goat being slain. Its legs are bent. It's in a very vulnerable position. We see the tail of vitality, the fish with full of life. So from the sacrifice comes life. And we see Mars dead in the center of the sign. So the sacrificial lamb has come to make war with Satan. He's come to finish the job. And then not only that, but we see it right in between the horns of Taurus, which is judgment, we see Saturn, the planet of Satan. So September the 15th in the year 3 BC was the sign of the Magi. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you from a terrestrial perspective how the sign came into formation, and then also what the Magi would have seen from the ground, and the actions that they would have taken based on what they saw. So remember that we saw 3 years prior to this Saturn and Jupiter conjuncting three times, and what we're going to see is Jupiter conjuncting with Regulus 3 times within the space of about a year from this date. So this was the first time that Jupiter conjuncts with Regulus, and this was when the Messiah was born. 15 September 3 BC. Praise the Lord for this day. So here we are in Babylon looking over the eastern horizon in the year 3 BC. We're in the month of May, and you'll recall that 3 years prior to this there was the final conjunction between Jupiter and Saturn in the constellation of Pisces. So the Magi had been given their heads up. And in the year 6 BC and 5 and 4 BC, there was nothing of notice or notable that happened around the time of Rosh Hashanah, but that all changed in 3 BC. So the Magi would have been watching each morning in anticipation for the next coming Rosh Hashanah. And I'm going to go forward 24 hours. We're watching, it's 4 a.m. in the morning, and I'm going to go forward by 24 hours. So we're going to skip 24 hours to the next 4 a.m. each morning, and you can watch at the top here as I go forward. So we're on May the 23rd, the 24th, the 25th, etc. 26th, 27th, and Venus starts to move towards Saturn that enters into the horns of Taurus. And the Magi would have known these constellations like the back of their hands, and this would have been very interesting to them. So as Venus approaches Saturn, and I'm going to click on the moon so we can see how old it is. The moon's age is 28 days. As Venus merges with Saturn, it's the new moon, and this is the month of Tammuz. So this would have really got the Magi interested. This major conjunction happening on a new moon in the month of Tammuz would have made them really prick their ears up and watch. So we're going to go forward again, and we're going to go through the months of Gemini and the month of Cancer, and the Magi would have been looking forward to the constellation of Leo rising. As the constellation of Leo starts to rise in the morning, this is what they would have seen. This is what they described. We saw his star rise in the east, and Venus coming down and just about to meet with Jupiter. You can see this moon is now 27 days old, and right on the new moon, right there, you can see there's the age of the moon. It's now the new moon, Venus and Jupiter conjunct. This would have been the first of Elul, exactly the same day that the eclipse happened, 33 days before the Revelation chapter 12 sign. This is the first of Elul, 33 days before the sign of the Magi. You couldn't make this up. So what we see happening at the sign of the Magi is exactly what we saw happening on the Revelation chapter 12 sign with the eclipse. This was for the Magi, the eclipse was for everyone. It was a national sign, it was an international sign. Everyone knew about the eclipse. So I'm going to go forward to the actual Rosh Hashanah. So you can see this is his star again rising, and each morning they would have seen it. And on Rosh Hashanah, September 15th, 3 BC, bang, Jupiter is directly over the king star Regulus. And we're going to go forward from 4 a.m. so that we can see what it looked like as the sun rose. And at 4 a.m. Zania and Venus are merged, and the morning star are both seen, Mercury and Venus. And this is very unusual. You can just see Mercury pop up over the horizon when it's a suitable distance from the sun. And that is the Magi sign, the sign of the Magi, September the 15th, 3 BC, from a terrestrial perspective. So you can see clearly what they meant by we saw his star rise in the east. So what happened after the 15th of September is a matter of speculation, but what we do know is that the sign was most definitely not something that was supernatural from a local perspective. So there was some conjecture that the sign was the Shekinah glory that went before them, and that's obviously not the case, because we can prove exactly how the sign worked and what they saw now looking at astronomy programs. What happened after the 15th of September was there was then a king triple conjunction between Jupiter and Regulus, the king star and the king planet. The three conjunctions with Regulus was obviously the first one on September the 15th. The second conjunction between Regulus and Jupiter was on February the 18th. And the third conjunction was on May the 8th. So you'll see, as I'm just about to show you, they meet 3 times, and then shortly after the third time there's a Jupiter and Venus conjunction on June the 17th. So now we're going to watch what happened from September the 15th, 3 BC, Rosh Hashanah, Jesus Christ's birthday, going forward. Jupiter goes along the ecliptic and then starts to go into retrograde motion for a second conjunction, which it will meet with Regulus, or just over Regulus. It's almost crowning Regulus on February the 18th. Then it goes forward and meets Regulus again for a third conjunction on May the 8th. And what we see is Venus coming along, and it's just about to have a conjunction with Jupiter, which is on June the 17th. And between Christ's birthday on September the 15th and this Jupiter-Venus conjunction is almost exactly 9 months. It's 9 months and 2 days. So let's have a look at a comparison between what happened in 7 to 6 BC between Jupiter and Saturn, and what happened in 3 to 2 BC between Jupiter and Regulus. So the heads up was what happened in 7 to 6 BC, and just like the Revelation chapter 12 sign, our heads up were the blood moons. So this is an area which is open to some speculation. A lot of people believe that the Magi waited in Babylon for the full 3 conjunctions before they left to Jerusalem. But the problem that I have with that is here we have the final and the third conjunction between Jupiter and Regulus. And as you can clearly see, it's a star which is now setting in the west. So we can see the day, it becomes a night star, and the day sets, and now it's setting in the west. And the Bible clearly says that the star came to a head above the child. So we cannot reconcile this, because if we have a look at the azimuth, and the azimuth is anytime somebody looks directly above them, doesn't matter where they are on the planet, that is what their azimuth is. So I have this set to Bethlehem, although I have the horizon as Jerusalem. They're very close to one another. But if I put the horizontal grid up, which is the azimuth, you can see you cannot reconcile this being standing directly over the child. So what I believe happened was, at the very first conjunction, they would have started to prepare the procession to depart for Jerusalem. And they had already had the heads up, which happened 3 years before with the Jupiter and Saturn conjunction in Pisces. They'd had the 33-day heads up, which was on the 1st of Elul between Jupiter and Venus. So when Rosh Hashanah came and they saw the sign of the Magi, they would have began to get the procession ready. They would have arranged the camels, got the water, organized the gold, the frankincense, and the myrrh, and arranged all of that, those details, in order to begin to travel towards Jerusalem. Then between the first conjunction and the second conjunction was a 5-month period. So they wouldn't have left straight away. They would have organized all their business first, and then come in and questioned Herod. And when they questioned Herod, and he realized that he wasn't the king of the Jews, and he questioned his wise men, and they all conferred, and they realized that he had been born in Bethlehem, and that's when they went off to Bethlehem. And we can see the second conjunction was directly above Bethlehem. So this would have been the azimuth. This would have been the star coming to a still, because it would have been in retrograde motion above the child. So if we see when it rises on the second conjunction, that would have been in a southeasterly direction, which they would have followed to Bethlehem. And if we have a look at the compass for Jerusalem, you can see from Jerusalem to Bethlehem is in a southeasterly direction. So next I'm going to discuss the Revelation chapter 12 sign. We all know the sign comes into fulfillment, and Jupiter's been waiting in the womb of Virgo for 9 months. And in my other videos I've shown that Saturn has been waiting around at the foot of Ophiuchus for roughly the same period of time. So it's been sitting there and waiting and doing nothing for 9 months, but waiting until the sign comes to fulfillment. And as the sign comes to fulfillment, then we see Saturn starting to move from the foot of Ophiuchus. And the first constellation that Saturn goes into is the constellation of Sagittarius. And the first constellation that Jupiter goes into is the constellation of Libra. So Libra can be seen as one of two things. It can either be seen as judgment, which is perfectly valid. It's the judgment of Jesus Christ. Or it can be seen as the altar, which is the throne room of God, where the church will be, as soon as they're raptured, they will be standing in the throne room of God. Can't wait. But if we look at Saturn and going into the constellation of Sagittarius, I believe that Sagittarius is a representation of the Antichrist. The stars in Sagittarius mean, some of them say Prince of the Earth, which is clearly Satan. And John describes a rider on a white horse, and to him was given a bow and a crown. Now, if God wanted to represent something to us that was a depiction of a beast, how better would he do it than a man who is half human and half horse? So I think that Sagittarius actually is a representation of the Antichrist. I know that Bullinger's book and some of the other books which discuss the constellations try to attribute Sagittarius to Jesus Christ, but I don't think that's correct. I think that this is open to interpretation, and I think that the interpretation is more likely that this is the Antichrist, because it's the first place that Saturn goes into, and there's a rider with a bow and a crown. So here we can see Jupiter going into the sign of Libra, and we can see Mercury going into retrograde motion around Saturn. So you will recall in my other videos I showed that Mercury was on the sign of the Magi in retrograde motion meeting with Venus. In the sign of Revelation chapter 12, Mercury is meeting with Mars, that is war. Now we see Mercury meeting with Saturn, the planet of Satan, and this is happening right as Jupiter is merging with Mars in the constellation of Libra, right in between the scales. Then Mars goes on to the Scorpion, and we know that the fallen angels, or the locusts which come out of the bottomless pit, are described as having the sting of a scorpion. So this is perfectly legitimate to fit in with what we see in the book of Revelation. As we go along, we see Saturn moving towards Capricorn, and Jupiter starting to close in on Saturn. And as we come up to December the 21st, there is a major conjunction between Saturn and Jupiter right on the winter solstice. And you'll recall that 3 years before the sign of the Magi, there was a major conjunction between Jupiter and Saturn right on the winter solstice. And now we see a major conjunction between Jupiter and Saturn 3 years after the Revelation chapter 12 sign, right on the winter solstice. And then what happens is we see a perfect representation of the Antichrist entering into the temple and setting himself up as God. And we know that he causes the sacrifice and oblation to cease. And that sacrifice is valid, it's recognized by Jesus Christ, and God set that sacrifice up himself. So the sacrifice is made to cease, and Satan or Satan entering into the temple is the abomination, not the sacrifice itself. And we can see here is a perfect representation of Saturn entering into the temple and the Jupiter, the righteousness, being pushed out, and Mercury is coming around to meet Jupiter. So as I've mentioned before, we saw in the Magi sign, Mercury came around to meet Venus in retrograde motion. In the sign of the Revelation chapter 12 sign, Mercury goes around in retrograde motion to meet Mars, that's war. In the sign of in between the sign, we see Mercury meeting with Saturn, which is the planet of Satan, and here we see Mercury meeting with Jupiter. It's a perfect story which is being told in the heavens, guys. Also, exactly 1,260 days, as I've shown in my other video and I'll show in this one, is a comet that is flying across the constellation of Capricorn, and I'm going to zoom in so we can see exactly how it's coming across. See how Mercury comes to meet Jupiter and usher Jupiter out of the sign of Capricorn. There's a comet which is flying across the Capricorn sign and meeting Jupiter and Mercury. That is exactly 1,260 days. You can see there's a comet right between Jupiter and Mercury, and the name of that comet is Temple. The name of the comet that is directly between Jupiter and Mercury, exactly 1,260 days after Rosh Hashanah, is called Temple. This is not contrived. This is a perfect representation of the Antichrist entering into the temple 1,260 days after Rosh Hashanah. The sacrificial lamb, Jupiter being pushed out, Satan's right in the center. Then what we see, we know that the angels are going to pour out the vials of wrath. It moves from the seals of judgment to the vials, and this is what we see next. Is the next constellation is this wrath being poured out, and after Aquarius, the constellation is Pisces, and Pisces is the representation of Israel. One is going upwards towards God. One is going backwards along the ecliptic, going backwards towards man, and this is the wrath being poured out. So the Israelites which don't leave to the wilderness, and the ones that stay are the ones that are going backwards along the ecliptic, and those are the ones that are going to have the wrath of God. And we know that in the book of Revelation it says that John saw a dragon rising up from the sea. This is a perfect representation of that. Aries, the constellation of Aries, which is the lamb, the sacrificial lamb, has always had 1 foot between one band of the one fish, which belongs to Pisces. So the fish that goes upwards towards God, the ones that go into the wilderness will be saved by the sacrificial lamb. The ones that go backwards along the ecliptic will enjoy the wrath of God that the other people who are not obedient to God. So these are not Yeshua's flock. They are going to experience his wrath. And what we can see, exactly 2,520 days, that is 1,260 times 2, first half of tribulation and the second half of tribulation, exactly 2,520 days after Rosh Hashanah, we see a conjunction of Mars and Jupiter directly between the horns of Taurus, which is judgment, and we know he's coming back in vengeance to judge the world. So this is not a coincidence. This is absolutely perfect as far as the book of Revelation is concerned. The dates on which things happen, and the picture and the map which is drawn out for us in the heavens along the ecliptic. Then also after exactly 2,520 days, when we see the conjunction between Mars and Jupiter, we see Saturn is directly beneath the urn of Aquarius. So we know that the final judgment, which is the wrath poured out, will be on the air, and Satan is the prince of the power of the air. This is an image which I have on revelationchapter12.com. It has the horizon as the city of Jerusalem, and I've just covered up the mud hut with an old coin. And we can see 1,260 days after Rosh Hashanah, directly above Jerusalem, the azimuth shows that the mid-tribulation sign is there. So this could be anywhere along the ecliptic. These constellations might be anywhere as far as the day is concerned. But here we see them directly above Jerusalem on both occasions. And then 2,520 days after Rosh Hashanah, we see the Jupiter and Mars conjunction right between the horns of Taurus, and that is also directly above Jerusalem. So next we're going to look at the Revelation chapter 12 sign from a terrestrial perspective. We started off with about the MUL.APIN tablets and how the Babylonians and the Chaldeans used to read the stars in the morning and the evening, and that's how the Revelation chapter 12 sign should be read. We're standing on the Mount of Olives, and we're facing in the eastward direction and watching the sunrise in Israel. And it's 3 a.m. in the morning, and Venus is starting to rise, and we'll be able to see Mars and then Mercury beneath that. And then from about 5 a.m. The sun is going to obscure Leo, and it will rise and it'll go over Jerusalem. And then we're going to look in the western horizon, and interestingly you'll see what's facing the western horizon if we're looking from the Mount of Olives. And coming up to 7 p.m. we're now at 7 p.m. and you can see that there's the moon right there, and on the western horizon coming up to 8 p.m. is when the sign will set. So the sign of the Magi was a sign which was rising in the east, and the sign of Revelation, when it comes into its fulfillment, is a sign that is setting in the west. And that is how the Revelation chapter 12 sign should be read.